Welcome to Blue Media Channel, everyone. Today, we begin our series on unknown modern wars with the story of India's successful struggle to reclaim its territories from the colonial power of Portugal. We would greatly appreciate your support for our work by liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and not forgetting to turn on the notification bell. Enjoy the viewing. With the Turks' conquest of Anatolia and the Crusaders' definitive defeat by the Turkic ruler Baybars, leading to their expulsion from the Middle East, control over all major trade routes fell entirely into Muslim hands. Consequently, Western Europeans, eager to engage in the lucrative silk and spice trades and reach India and China, were forced to pay heavy taxes to the Turks, enriching the Muslims in the process. It was the Portuguese and the Spaniards who would first break this chain for Europeans, inadvertently initiating geographic discoveries to reach China and India independently of the Turks. The primary motivation behind the Portugueses' initiation of geographic discoveries was particularly fascinating. According to legend, a very powerful Christian king named Priest John ruled over India. The Portuguese believed that this Christian king governing India had a formidable army and planned to seek his support to defeat and humiliate the Turks by attacking from two fronts simultaneously. However, at that time, India was ruled from north to south by the Delhi Sultanate under the control of the Karluk Turks and Oghuz Turks, followed by the Mughal Empire. Consequently, on their journey to reach India, the Portuguese colonized South America and eventually ended up with some territories that could be described as remnants left by the British, who had colonized most of India. Thus, the Portuguese no longer needed this mythical Christian king, as their colonies had already transformed them into a significant naval power. The Portuguese Empire, a maritime nation with a large naval force, reached its peak in the 1600s and began to decline in power from the 1800s onwards. By 1950, the power disparity between India and Portugal had sharply turned against the latter. The centuries-long colonial era began to come to an end with India's declaration of independence from the British in 1947. Following this, numerous Indian armed organizations started to form in the region of Dadra and Nagar Haveli, still under Portuguese occupation, for guerrilla warfare. Supported by India, these organizations attacked, storming a police station in Dadra and killing 3 Portuguese policemen. Following this incident, the Portuguese were forced to retreat from Dadra, which was then easily taken over by the Indians. Eventually, Captain Virgilio Fidalgo fled with his 150 fighters, and following their surrender, Neroli, Luhari, and Silvassa also fell into Indian hands. Not stopping there, the Indians naturally wanted more and moved to liberate a much larger settlement area, the state of Goa, the last Portuguese colonial holdout in India. Portugal was determined not to withdraw from Goa. India initially made a diplomatic request to Portugal for the peaceful transfer of Goa to India. However, Portugal firmly rejected this request, considering Goa an integral part of Portuguese territory. In 1955, when over 3,000 Indian demonstrators attempted to enter Goa, Portuguese armed forces opened fire, killing nearly 30 Indians. Left with no other option, India began to fully support numerous organizations to start an armed resistance. As a result, more than 80 Portuguese soldiers were killed in organized armed attacks. The majority of the Indian insurgents were experienced former soldiers who had fought against the Germans in world wars under British command and were fully supported by the Indian government. In March 1960, Portuguese Defense Minister General Julio Botelho Moniz warned Prime Minister Salazar that Portugal's stubbornness was creating a suicidal mission that could not succeed for the army, a warning supported by many senior officers. However, dictator Salazar ignored these warnings and insisted on not giving up Goa. He sent a message to the governor of Goa, Manuel Antonio Vassalo Silva, ordering Portuguese forces in Goa to fight to their last man. The message contained these strange sentences: do not expect a ceasefire or the possibility of Portuguese prisoners, for I feel that our soldiers and sailors will either triumph or die." Following the increase in attacks and territorial losses, 3 infantry battalions and support units were urgently transferred from mainland Portugal and its colonies, Angola and Mozambique, to Goa. A battalion of locally trained Indians was also added as reinforcement, boosting Portugal's military presence in India from almost 0 to 12,000 men. However, this number was still insufficient against India's vast manpower. The overwhelming majority of Portuguese leaders and military commanders were aware that they could not win the war against India's military superiority. However, they believed that if they could mount a strong resistance by a miracle, India would retreat from its major offensive. For Portugal, this hope was reversed in 1960 when the Undersecretary for the Portuguese Army, Francisco da Costa Gomes, during an inspection visit to India, referenced the expected start of guerrilla activities in Angola, leading to the decision that Portugal's military presence in its African territories needed reinforcement. Consequently, the number of Portuguese forces in India drastically fell to 4,000, a tragically low number. This drastic reduction was due to overconfidence in Portugal's defense plan, which included demolishing all bridges and digging trenches along roads and beaches to delay the Indian army. However, even the plan to mine roads and beaches could not be fully implemented due to the insufficient number of mines available. The main strength of the Portuguese Navy in India was the Afonso de Albuquerque, a battleship of British manufacture. Aware of the inadequacy of their naval power, Portugal sought to reinforce it with additional warships. However, this endeavor failed when Jamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt at the time, blocked their passage through the Suez Canal. As for air forces, they were virtually non-existent. Aware of this deficiency, Portugal sent 2 Douglas DC-6 transport aircraft, manufactured in the USA and capable of carrying 10 tons of anti-tank grenades, to India. Nevertheless, this initiative also failed as no state along the route, including Pakistan, allowed the use of their airbases or airspace, forcing the 2 transport planes to fly unarmed to the airport in Goa. On November 24, 1961, Portuguese ground forces opened fire on the passenger boat Sabarmati, which was traveling between India's Kochi port and the Portuguese-held island of Angitive, resulting in the death of a passenger and the injury of the chief engineer. The action was motivated by Portuguese fears that the boat was carrying a military unit intending to land on the island. This bloody incident generated widespread public support in India for military action in Goa. As the sound of India's military attack grew louder, most Portuguese civilians began fleeing Goa. Finally, the Indians began provoking the Portuguese by flying British-made Vampire and F-54 night fighter aircraft over the Dabolim airport in Goa, to which the Portuguese responded with anti-aircraft fire. Additionally, India positioned the British-made INS Vikrant aircraft carrier off the coast of Goa, aiming to block any potential foreign military support for Portugal. The conflict in Goa commenced on December 17, 1961, at 9:45, with an Indian unit attacking and occupying the town of Malingam in the northeast, killing 2 Portuguese soldiers. Although Portuguese forces requested permission to engage with the Indians, their request was denied, and it was announced that orders for the Portuguese army would come directly from headquarters, leading to confusion in the command chain. The Indians continued their advance, and following incorrect intelligence about heavy Portuguese tanks in the south of Malingam, the Indian army began an artillery bombardment of Portuguese positions. As planned, Portuguese forces destroyed the bridge in Bicholi, followed by the destruction of bridges in Colvalis Chapora and Asanora. On the morning of December 18, the Indian Army's 50th Parachute Brigade advanced on Goa from 3 directions. As Portuguese forces retreated in an orderly fashion, the Indian Army continued its rapid advance. Eventually, an Indian serving in the Portuguese army crossed the Mandovi River and delivered a ceasefire proposal letter from Major Acacio Tenreiro, the self-proclaimed military commander of Goa City in the Portuguese army, to Major Shivdev Singh Sidhu, commander of the Indian 7th Cavalry Regiment. Following the letter, Major Shivdev Singh Sidhu led a force from the 7th Cavalry Regiment to secure the surrender of Aguada Fort that same night. However, the fort's Portuguese defenders had not yet received orders to surrender and fired upon the Indian forces, resulting in the deaths of Major Sidhu and Captain Vinod Sehgal in the ensuing battle. Subsequently, Indian forces crossed the Mandovi River and captured the city of Panaji without encountering any resistance. Meanwhile, the 63rd Indian Infantry Brigade advanced in 2 columns to the east. The right column was from the 2nd Bihar Regiment, and the left column from the 3rd Sikh Regiment, with the 4th Sikh Infantry providing rear support. As the 4th Sikh Regiment advanced towards Mormugao Port, they encountered fierce resistance from a 500-strong Portuguese unit near the village of Verna. Joined by the 2nd Bihar Regiment as reinforcement, they engaged in intense combat and, within a few hours, had captured all Portuguese soldiers. All forces then converged and advanced towards the main body of the Portuguese army waiting at Mormugao and Dabalam Airport. The Indian Air Force launched attacks on Dabalam Airport, where the main Portuguese forces were stationed, with 20 British-made jet-powered Canberra bombers. Approximately 28 tons of bombs were dropped, completely destroying the runway. The Indians had received incorrect intelligence that the Portuguese possessed a squadron of American-made F-86 Sabres at the airport, leading to the heavy bombardment. However, there were only 2 DC-4 transport planes at the airport, which, in a miraculous feat, the Portuguese managed to fly out under cover of darkness and at a very low altitude, escaping to Karachi, Pakistan, with civilians on board. The only air defense system at the airport consisted of 2 outdated anti-aircraft guns. Following consecutive defeats, the Portuguese mounted one of their rare and strong resistances throughout the war. The Indians encountered unexpected resistance when they attacked Anjadiv Island, a deserted territory belonging to the Goa region. Portuguese sailors had retreated to defend the island, and as Indian sailors began to land on the island under artillery fire from the Indian Navy, the fierce battle ensued. Not only did the Portuguese sailors manage to repel the Indians, but they also killed 7 Indian sailors and wounded 19, including 2 officers among the casualties. The Portuguese defense was eventually overcome following intense bombardment from Indian warships. The island was captured by the Indians the next day, with all Portuguese defenders taken prisoner except for 2 corporals and 1 private killed. Meanwhile, Portuguese soldier Manuel Catano escaped by swimming from the island and, after reaching the Indian coast, became the last Portuguese soldier to be captured in India. By the morning of December 18, the target was the NRP Afonso de Albuquerque, the main force of the Portuguese Navy, anchored off Mormugao Port. The ship had taken on additional tasks beyond combating the increased Indian naval forces, such as maintaining radio communication with Portugal after the destruction of radio facilities in air raids. In the duel between British-manufactured warships, 3 Indian frigates led by INS Betwa positioned themselves off the port to attack Afonso and secure sea access to the port. During this time, Indian warplanes bombed Mormugao Port. Subsequently, INS Betwa and INS Bias raided the port, opening fire on Afonso with their 4.5-inch guns. The Portuguese, relying on maritime and naval tradition, responded to the Indians' calls for surrender by firing back with their 120mm guns. Afonso's last radio message to Lisbon was as follows: "We are under attack, we are responding." However, the Portuguese were at a significant disadvantage, as their 4 120mm guns could only fire 2 rounds per minute, compared to the Indian frigate's capacity to fire 36 rounds per minute. Shortly after the exchange of fire began, Afonso was directly hit in the control tower, injuring the gunnery officer. Then, an anti-personnel shrapnel bomb launched by an Indian ship exploded directly above the ship, killing the radio officer and severely injuring Captain Antonio da Cunha Aragao. The command was then taken over by First Officer Pinto de Cruz. Captain Aragao had handed over command to First Officer Sarmento Gouveia with the condition that they would not surrender. The ship's propulsion system was also heavily damaged in the attack. Despite this, the Portuguese continued to resist until a sergeant, contrary to the captain's orders, hoisted a white flag on the ship's flagpole, signaling surrender. However, since the Indians did not see the white flag, they continued their bombardment. After the bombardment, the white flag was raised again, and the battle for Afonso resumed. Afonso fired approximately 400 shells and managed to hit 2 Indian ships. After sustaining heavy damage, the order was given to abandon the ship. Under intense fire directed at both the ship and the shore, part of the crew, including the gunnery personnel, abandoned the ship and reached the shore. They were followed by the remaining crew, who set fire to the ship and went directly to the shore, including the injured commander, who was then transported by car to a hospital in Panaji. Thus, the Portuguese managed to hit 2 Indian warships and killed 5 and wounded 13 Indian sailors. The Portuguese patrol boat NRP Sirius, under the command of Lieutenant Marques Silva, was also present in Goa at the time. After observing Afonso run aground and losing communication with Goa Naval Command, they scuttled their ship. The crew narrowly escaped capture by Indian forces and fled to Pakistan on a Greek cargo ship. The Indians then moved to attack the Portuguese garrison in Damdan. Commanded by Major Antonio José da Costa Pinto, the garrison consisted of 360 soldiers and 230 police officers, with their most significant weaponry being 87.6 mm guns, although even these had insufficient and outdated ammunition. The Indian forces, consisting of a battalion and 3 companies, intended to conduct a surprise attack but failed and lost 3 soldiers when trying to capture the control tower. In response to Portuguese resistance, the Indians bombed Portuguese positions with French-manufactured Dassault Mystère 4 fighter jets. Subsequently, Indian artillery began bombarding Dalmau Grande. By 11:30 a.m., Portuguese forces resisting Indian advances at Verecunda's eastern border ran out of ammunition and retreated westward to Catra. At 12 p.m., following the withdrawal from Verecunda, a Portuguese artillery battery on the Rio São Carlos shore was ordered to fire at the Indians but instead, commanded by Captain Felgueiras de Souza, chose to surrender without firing. By 1 p.m., Portuguese forces at Calicaquigo's eastern border had completely exhausted their ammunition and retreated towards the shore. By 5 p.m., in the absence of resistance, the Indians had occupied most of the region, excluding the airport and Dalmau Pequeno, where the Portuguese last showed resistance. By this time, the Indian Air Force had conducted 6 more air raids, severely demoralizing the Portuguese forces. At 8 p.m., after a meeting among Portuguese commanders, a delegation was sent to initiate negotiations with the Indian lines, but they were fired upon and forced to retreat. A similar attempt by artillery to surrender the next morning at 8 a.m. also came under fire. The Indians attacked the airport the following morning, and by 11 a.m., the Portuguese surrendered without a fight. Major Costa Pinto, although injured, was carried on a stretcher to the airport since the Indians insisted on accepting the surrender only from him. Approximately 24 Portuguese officers, 600 soldiers, and police were taken prisoner by the Indians, who suffered 4 dead and 14 wounded, while the Portuguese had 10 dead and 2 wounded. The next target of the Indians was the Portuguese garrison in Dio, which arguably demonstrated the most successful defense and resistance throughout the entire war. This garrison was led by Major Fernando de Almeida e Vasconcelos, who commanded approximately 400 soldiers and police officers. The Portuguese defense successfully repelled the Indians' initial uncoordinated attacks by returning fire with 87.6 mm guns and mortars, inflicting heavy losses on the Indian forces. The Portuguese artillery managed to repel multiple Indian assaults, causing significant damage to the Indian forces. The Indians attempted once more to capture the airport directly but were again repelled by well-positioned Portuguese soldiers. The Portuguese army's defense network, established with machine guns, paralyzed the Indian forces, forcing them to withdraw after repeated unsuccessful assaults. While Portugal claimed this heroic defense was achieved with only 8 soldiers, the Indians claimed they were resisted by 130 Portuguese soldiers. Forced to retreat under bombardment, the Portuguese had to abandon their positions in Passo Covo and withdraw to the town of Malala at dawn, further weakened by heavy artillery fire and bombardments from the Indian cruiser INS Delhi stationed off Dio. Subsequently, Portuguese commanders decided to surrender, resulting in 1 Portuguese governor, 18 officers, 43 sergeants, and 403 soldiers being captured. During the conflicts, 7 Portuguese soldiers were killed. The Portuguese governor later stated that they could have stopped the Indian advance for several more days, but surrendered due to the overwhelming power of the Indian Air Force and Navy. Without any Portuguese fighter aircraft, the anti-aircraft units on the ground were quickly overwhelmed by the Indian Air Force. Meanwhile, the Portuguese patrol boat NRP Vega, after detecting 2 Indian fighter jets and opening fire with its 20 mm Oerlikon gun without success, was attacked twice by the returning Indian aircraft, resulting in the deaths of the captain and gunner, and forcing the remainder of the crew to abandon the ship and be captured as prisoners of war. Portugal's complaint to the United Nations about India remained unaddressed due to Soviet support for India, paving the way for India's final assault. On the evening of December 18, the majority of Goa was invaded by advancing Indian forces, with over 2,000 Portuguese soldiers stationed at the Alparqueiros military base at the entrance to the port city of Vasco da Gama. According to the Portuguese strategy named Plano Sentinela, the defense forces were to show their last resistance at the port and withstand the Indian forces until reinforcements from the Portuguese Navy arrived. Orders from the President of Portugal required a scorched earth policy, insisting that Goa be destroyed before being handed over to the Indians. Salazar asked Vasilo e Silva to resist for at least 8 days, during which time he convinced himself that international support would be gathered against the Indian invasion. However, despite orders from Lisbon, General Governor Manuel Antonio Vasilo e Silva, considering the numerical superiority of Indian forces and evaluating the stocks of food and ammunition of his forces, decided not to obey Salazar to prevent unnecessary loss of life and decided to surrender to India the day after the Indian invasion. He sent a message to all Portuguese forces under his command stating, considering the defense of the Mormugao Peninsula against enemy air, sea, and land fire, and taking into account the disparity between forces and resources, the situation does not allow us to continue the fight without sacrificing the lives of the residents of Vasco da Gama to a great extent. In view of my patriotism, I have decided to initiate contact with the enemy. I am ordering a ceasefire for all my forces. Thus ended Portugal's 451-year occupation in India, marking the end of an era in Portugal's golden age. In total, 4,668 Portuguese soldiers and civilians were captured by the Indian Army. After surrendering, Portuguese soldiers were held under harsh conditions by the Indian Army in their own military camps in Navelim, Aguada, Ponda, and Alparqueiros, sleeping on concrete floors and performing hard labor. A few years later, Indian Air Marshal Raghavendran would write in his memoirs, "I have never seen a group of soldiers look so miserable in my life. They were short, not well built, and definitely did not look like soldiers." The 2-day conflict resulted in the deaths of 22 Indians and 30 Portuguese soldiers. Portugal's repeated appeals to the United Nations to stop India, described as the aggressor, were repeatedly rejected by the Russians, leading Salazar to comment that the effective power in the UN had now shifted to communist, African, and Asian countries. Salazar also expressed his frustration with England for ignoring Portugal's use of English airfields, stating, "Had it not been for this delay, we would certainly have found an alternative route and could have reinforced India with people and materials for its continuous defense." He suggested that, had their plans materialized, they might not have been defeated by India. The successful Indian operation was supported by Russia and Indonesia, while the United States, England, Brazil, the Netherlands, and Pakistan opposed it. China remained neutral. Feel free to ask in the comments if you have any questions. You can also share your opinions and requests with us. Stay tuned for more videos. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell to stay updated. Wishing you beautiful and healthy days ahead. Goodbye.